Trapped by a haunted house, the terrifying choice that changes everything. Chapter 1: The Reunion. Elena leaned against the steering wheel, her eyes tracing the winding road that led up the hill. The drive had been longer than she remembered, the sun casting long shadows through the trees, her branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The house on the hill loomed ahead, silhouette dark against the fading light of day. A part of her hesitated, her heart skipping a beat as old memories stirred, a mix of warmth and something darker, feeling she couldn't quite place. She took a deep breath and drove the final stretch, her car tires crunching over the gravel path. As the house came fully into view, Elena couldn't help but feel a pang of nostalgia. The structure was just as she remembered, tall, with weathered shingles and a wide porch that sagged slightly under the weight of time. Ivy crawled up the stone walls, clinging to the house as if trying to hold it together. The windows, some cracked and others clouded with age, stared blankly out at her, like the vacant eyes of a forgotten sentinel. She parked the car and stepped out, the cool evening air brushing against her skin. Silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the distant rustling of leaves. For a moment, she stood still, her gaze fixed on the front door. It seemed larger now, more imposing than it had been when they were children. Back then, it had been a gateway to endless summer days filled with laughter and exploration. Now it felt like a barrier, something that kept the outside world at bay. A car pulled up behind her, and she turned to see Martin emerging, his face creased with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He looked older, more worn, as if the years had been particularly harsh. Elena waved, forcing a smile, and he walked over to her, pulling her into a brief, awkward hug. "Elena," he said, his voice a bit too loud in the stillness. "It's been too long." "Too long," she echoed, glancing back at the house. "I almost forgot how isolated this place is." "Yeah, it's something, all right?" Martin replied, following her gaze. "Hard to believe we used to love coming here." They were joined soon by Claire, Tom, and Lily, each arriving with their own stories etched into the lines of their faces. Claire, once the most vibrant among them, now moved with a certain hesitation, as if the weight of the years had taken its toll. Tom's once athletic frame had softened, and Lily's bright eyes now held a shadow, trace of something left unspoken. 5 of them stood together in front of the house, their presence somehow too small against its looming facade. There was a brief moment of silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts, before Tom cleared his throat. "Well, we're here," he said, his voice breaking the spell. "Shall we go in?" They walked up the steps together, the wood creaking under their combined weight. Elena reached for the door handle, her hand trembling slightly. She pushed it open, and the door groaned in protest, the sound echoing through the empty halls. The inside of the house was dim, the last rays of sunlight barely penetrating the thick curtains that hung over the windows. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, touching the light in tiny, sparkling fragments. The air was heavy with the scent of old wood and something else, something faintly metallic, like the lingering scent of rain on stone. They stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath their feet. The hallway stretched out before them, long and narrow, with doors leading off into the shadows. Elena could almost hear the echoes of their younger selves running down these halls, their laughter bouncing off the walls. But now, the house was silent, the only sound the faint ticking of a distant clock. "Feels like nothing's changed," Claire murmured, her voice soft, as if she feared disturbing the silence. "Everything's changed," Martin replied, his tone heavy. "We've changed." They moved further into the house, exploring rooms that had once been so familiar. The furniture was covered in sheets, ghostly shapes that seemed to shift in the dim light. A large mirror in the sitting room reflected their images back at them, distorted by the dust that coated its surface. Elena caught a glimpse of her own reflection, pale, with eyes that seemed too large, too haunted. As they settled in, the house seemed to come alive around them. The lights flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. The doors creaked open and shut on their own, as if moved by an unseen hand. Elena felt a chill run down her spine, the sensation of being watched growing stronger with each passing moment. "It's just an old house," Tom said with a forced laugh, trying to break the tension. "Probably settling or something." But the unease lingered, constant presence just beneath the surface. They found themselves speaking in hushed tones, as if afraid of disturbing whatever it was that lay dormant in the walls. As the evening wore on, they gathered in the sitting room, fire in the hearth doing little to dispel the cold that seemed to seep up from the floor. They talked about their lives, their careers, their families, but the conversation felt strained, as if they were all avoiding the same subject. The house, with its strange noises and unsettling atmosphere, hung over them like a dark cloud, and none of them dared to address it directly. As the night deepened, Elena found herself staring into the flames, her mind drifting back to their childhood. The memories came in fragments, flashes of light and laughter, the sound of footsteps on the stairs, a door closing softly in the night. She frowned, trying to grasp onto the elusive details, but they slipped away, leaving only a vague sense of unease. "Do you ever wonder," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "if we forgot something important? Something we were supposed to remember?" The others looked at her, their expressions unreadable in the flickering light. "What do you mean?" Lily asked, her voice tight. Elena hesitated, unsure of how to put her thoughts into words. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "It's just something feels off, like there's something we're missing." Martin shifted in his seat, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. "Maybe it's just the house," he said. "Old places like this, they play tricks on your mind." "Yeah," Claire agreed, though her voice lacked conviction. "Just old memories coming back, that's all." But Elena couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it, something buried deep in the past, something they had all chosen to forget. And as she looked around at her old friends, she saw the same uncertainty reflected in their eyes. The night stretched on, and the house settled into a heavy silence. But that feeling of being watched, something lurking just beyond their sight, never left. And as they each retired to their rooms, the unease followed them. A shadow clung to their every step. In the darkness, the house on the hill seemed to breathe, its ancient walls alive with the memories of those who had come before. And in that silence, Elena could almost hear a voice, a soft whisper, calling her name, beckoning her deeper into the shadows. Chapter 2. Unearthing the Past. The dining room was a cavernous space, dominated by a long, dark wood table that gleamed dully under the soft light of a chandelier. It was a relic of another time, much like the house itself. The five friends sat around it, their faces bathed in the warm glow of the flickering candles. The atmosphere was thick with an odd blend of nostalgia and tension, as if the house itself was listening, waiting for the right moment to make its presence known. Dinner began with light conversation, clatter of silverware, a comforting backdrop to their idle chatter. They spoke of their lives, their careers, the paths they had taken since they last saw each other. But as the meal progressed, the conversation inevitably turned to the house and their childhood summers spent within its walls. "Do you remember the games we used to play in the woods?" Claire asked, her voice soft as she looked around the table, her eyes glimmering with the memory of those long-ago days. "We'd pretend we were explorers, searching for hidden treasure." Lily nodded, a faint smile playing on her lips. "We were so convinced there was something magical out there, beyond the trees. I think we even had a secret map, didn't we?" Elena laughed softly, but there was an edge to it. "Yes, I remember that map. It led us to the old well by the creek. We were sure it was hiding something, though I don't think we ever found anything." "Just a bunch of rusted nails and broken glass," Tom added, his brow furrowing as if trying to remember more clearly. "But it was exciting, wasn't it? Like we were on the brink of discovering something incredible." As they spoke, the mood began to shift. The warmth of the memories was slowly being overshadowed by something else, something darker. Their voices grew quieter, as if the very walls of the house were absorbing their words, twisting them into something new, something they didn't quite recognize. Martin, who had been uncharacteristically silent throughout the meal, suddenly spoke up. "Do any of you remember the night we got lost in the woods?" The table fell silent. Elena frowned, trying to recall the incident. "Lost? I don't think we ever got lost." "No, we did," Martin insisted, his voice steady but tinged with something. Fear, perhaps, or doubt. "It was late, and we couldn't find our way back to the house. I remember because we were all so scared. But when we finally found the path, it was like it had been there the whole time, right in front of us. Chill settled over the group. Claire bit her lip, her hands trembling slightly as she set down her fork. I don't remember that, whispered, her eyes darting around the table. I should remember something like that. But you don't, Martin said, his gaze fixed on her. None of us do, not really. And it's not the only thing. There's more, isn't there? Things we've forgotten, or maybe things we've chosen to forget. Elena felt a shiver run down her spine. The unease she'd been feeling since they arrived was growing stronger, more insistent. She glanced at the others, seeing the same confusion mirrored in their faces. There was something unsettling about the way the memories were surfacing, like fragments of a dream they had all shared, couldn't quite piece together. After dinner, they moved to the sitting room, fire crackling in the hearth, its light casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. Martin, who had been rummaging through an old cabinet, suddenly froze. He pulled out a faded photograph, holding it up to the light. "Look at this," he said, his voice low. The others gathered around him, peering at the image. It was a photograph of them as children, standing in front of the house. The sun was shining, and they were all smiling, their faces bright with the innocence of youth. There was something off about the picture, something that made Elena's stomach twist. "Who is that?" Lily asked, pointing to a figure in the background. It was a shadowy figure, partially obscured by the overgrown ivy that clung to the house. The figure was indistinct, almost ghostly, but it was undeniably there, lurking just behind them. "Was someone else with us that summer?" Tom asked, his voice shaky. "I don't remember anyone else being here." "No one was," Claire whispered, her face pale. "It was just us." They stared at the photograph, the room growing colder by the second. The fire in the hearth seemed to dim, as if something was drawing the warmth out of the room, leaving only the chill of unearthed memories. "Maybe it's just a trick of the light," Lena suggested, though she didn't believe it herself. The figure was too clear, too deliberate. There was no mistaking it. Someone, or something, had been there with them. As the night wore on, the house seemed to close in around them, the walls pressing in as if alive, breathing. The unease that had been simmering under the surface began to bubble over, manifesting in subtle ways. Footsteps echoing in empty hallways, doors that creaked open with no one near them, and shadows that shifted when no one was looking. Elena found herself drawn to the old mirror in the hallway, same one that had reflected their youthful images so many years ago. Now, as she looked into it, she saw something else. Fleeting image, a shadow behind her own reflection, gone the moment she blinked. Her heart raced, the sensation of being watched growing stronger with each passing moment. The others were similarly affected. Martin's hands shook as he leafed through an old book, the words blurring before his eyes. Claire kept glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting to see someone standing behind her. Tom's normally steady demeanor was fraying at the edges, his nerves stretched thin, and Lily, who had always been the most sensitive among them, seemed on the verge of tears, her fear barely contained. It was as if the house itself was reaching into their minds, pulling out memories they had buried deep. Memories that didn't fit with the idyllic childhood they had always believed they had. And with each passing hour, the line between memory and reality blurred further, until they could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. As the night deepened, they found themselves drawn back to the sitting room, where the fire had long since died down to embers. They sat in silence, the weight of their unease pressing down on them like a heavy shroud. "What is this place?" Elena whispered, her voice trembling. "What's happening to us?" No one had an answer. The house on the hill, once a place of laughter and light, had become a twisted reflection of their past, a labyrinth of memories that seemed determined to trap them within its walls. And as they sat there, the figure from the photograph lingered in their minds, a ghostly presence that refused to be forgotten, its shadow stretching out across the years, drawing them back to a time and place they could no longer remember, could never truly escape. Chapter 3. The night deepens. As twilight surrendered to darkness, the house seemed to breathe a heavier, more oppressive air. Friends had settled into the sitting room, the embers in the fireplace casting flickering shadows that danced ominously across the walls. The earlier unease had intensified, and each of them began to grapple with their own unsettling experiences. Elena was the first to break the silence. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. "I need some air," announced, her voice trembling. Without waiting for a response, she made her way to the large window that overlooked the dense woods surrounding the property. Pulling aside the heavy drapes, she gazed out into the inky blackness. There, in the dim light of the moon, she saw a figure standing motionless in the garden. It resembled her younger self, features soft and innocent, yet there was a haunting emptiness in its eyes. Elena blinked and the apparition vanished, leaving her heart pounding in her chest. She shook her head, trying to dispel the vision. The image lingered in her mind, unsettling her deeply. Claire, sensing Elena's distress, reached out to her. "Are you okay?" she asked gently, placing a hand on Elena's shoulder. But before Elena could respond, a soft, distorted melody began to fill the room. It was the lullaby her mother used to sing. The notes were warped, twisted into a melancholic dirge, sent shivers down her spine. Familiar tune, now eerie and sorrowful, echoed through the house, making her skin crawl. Tom sat silently, his usually composed demeanor cracking under the strain. Faint scent of smoke wafted into the room, triggering a flood of memories from his past. He remembered the devastating fire he had accidentally started as a child. Catastrophe that had left scars on all of them. The smell was so vivid that it felt as though the flames were licking at his nostrils, engulfing him in a relentless torment of guilt and regret. Lily, always the most perceptive, looked around nervously, her eyes darting from one shadow to another. She had been sensing a presence all evening, a constant whisper of fear that seemed to seep from the very walls of the house. Now, as the night deepened, her anxiety became almost tangible, a heavy blanket pressing down on her chest. Martin, who had been quiet since unearthing the photograph, finally spoke. "I think we need to confront whatever this is," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There are things we've forgotten, things we've buried deep inside ourselves. The house is forcing them out, making us face them." The others exchanged uneasy glances, weight of his words settling over them like a dark cloud. Elena turned back to the window, hoping to rid herself of the disturbing vision, but another figure now stood where the first had been, this one resembling a child, with hollow eyes and a sorrowful expression. The apparition raised a hand as if reaching out to her, and Elena felt an inexplicable pull, drawing her closer to the window. "Stop," she cried, stepping back from the glass. "This isn't real." But the house had other plan. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing thick and heavy. Whispers echoed through the halls, indistinct voices murmuring secrets long forgotten. Friends felt their minds twisting, memories blending with nightmares, reality blurring into something unrecognizable. As the night wore on, personal hauntings intensified. Elena found herself reliving moments of childhood innocence, tainted by hidden fears. Claire's distorted lullaby continued to haunt her, each note a reminder of the fragility of their past. Tom was tormented by the scent of smoke, the remnants of a tragedy he couldn't escape. Lily's constant feeling of being watched grew more oppressive, as if unseen eyes were scrutinizing her every move. Amidst the chaos, fragments of suppressed memories began to surface. The friends recalled a day long buried in their collective consciousness, a day when their playful adventures had taken a sinister turn. They remembered the mysterious child from the photograph, a boy who had appeared one summer, his presence both intriguing and unsettling. Together they had engaged in a cruel prank, locking him in the basement as part of a game. What was meant to be harmless had gone horribly wrong. The boy never returned, and the house had swallowed his disappearance into its dark embrace. The realization hit them like a physical blow, the truth too painful to fully acknowledge. Guilt and remorse gnawed at their hearts, the house feeding off their collective shame. It twisted their perceptions, making them question each other's motives and actions. Paranoia took root, seeds of distrust sprouting among them. Elena looked around the room, her eyes meeting Martin's. "We were responsible," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "We did something terrible." Martin nodded, his face pale. "We need to face it together. Ignoring it only gives the house more power. Claire clutched her arms around herself, shivering. But how? The house, it's alive. It's playing with us. Tom, his voice strained, added, "It's feeding on our fears and secrets. We have to stop it before it consumes us." Lily, her fear momentarily giving way to determination, spoke up. "Maybe if we confront what happened, we can put an end to this. We can't keep running from our past." As the friends began to grapple with their shared history, the house responded with increasing hostility. The temperature dropped, frost forming on the windows despite the absence of winter. Objects began to move on their own, doors slamming shut without warning. The once familiar halls now felt like a maze designed to trap them, each turn leading them deeper into their own personal nightmare. In the midst of the chaos, Elena noticed something she hadn't before, a hidden door behind a tapestry in the hallway. It was small, almost invisible, blending seamlessly with the wall. Her curiosity piqued. She motioned for the others to follow her. "Look," she said, pointing to the concealed entrance. "There's something here." With a collective sense of dread, they approached the door. Martin reached out, his hand shaking as he touched the cold metal handle. Taking a deep breath, he pulled it open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air that wafted up was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, faint sound of dripping water echoing from below. "Should we?" Tom asked, voice barely audible. Elena nodded, her resolve hardening. "We have to. The only way to understand what's happening." One by one, they descended the steps, the narrow passageways swallowing them into the bowels of the house. The walls seemed to close in, the darkness pressing against their skin like a physical force. As they reached the bottom, the flickering light from their flashlights revealed a basement cluttered with forgotten relics, old toys, broken furniture, and remnants of lives long past. In the center of the room stood an old wooden chest, surface scarred and weathered. Martin approached it cautiously, his hands trembling as he lifted the lid. Inside lay a collection of personal items, child's drawings, worn teddy bear, and a single empty frame. Air grew colder still, temperature dropping to a bone-chilling frost. Elena picked up one of the drawings, recognizing the stick figures as their childhood selves, and the mysterious boy who had vanished. Her fingers traced the lines, the memory of that day flooding back with vivid intensity. She could almost hear the boys' laughter, feel the weight of their collective guilt pressing down on her. "We have to remember," she whispered, her voice breaking. "We have to face what we did." As the friends stood together in the basement, the house's malevolent presence seemed to pulse around them, feeding off their fear and sorrow. The shadows danced on the walls, and the whispers grew louder. The cacophony of voices demanding acknowledgement, their transgressions. In that moment of shared vulnerability, the friends realized that their only hope lay in confronting their darkest memories and taking responsibility for their actions. The house, a silent witness to their past, had given them a chance to make amends, to seek redemption for the innocence lost. But as they began to speak, the basement door slammed shut, plunging them into darkness once more. The house had not finished with them yet, its influence still lingering, its agenda far from complete. The friends felt the weight of their past pressing down on them, the path to redemption fraught with uncertainty and fear. And as the night deepened, so did their understanding of the true nature of the house on the hill. A place where memories and nightmares intertwined, where the past refused to stay buried, and where the journey to forgiveness was as treacherous as the shadows that haunted their every step. Chapter 4: Fractured Bonds. The tension in the house thickened, a palpable force that seemed to push the friends further apart with each passing hour. What had once been a tight-knit group bound by shared history and affection, now frayed at the edges, their connections unraveling in the oppressive gloom that clung to the house like a shroud. Martin was the first to snap. His voice, once calm and steady, now trembled with suspicion as he rounded on Tom. "How do we know this isn't your doing?" he demanded, his eyes narrowing with mistrust. "You're the one who's always been drawn to dark things, always hiding something." Tom recoiled as if struck, his face a mask of disbelief. "You think I'd do this to us?" he retorted, his voice rising with anger. "Whatever this is, it's beyond any of us. It's this place. It's making us turn against each other." But the seed of doubt had already been planted. Claire, who had been clutching her arms around herself, shivered as she looked between them, her voice quivering. "We don't know what's real anymore," she whispered. "This house, it's twisting everything. How do we even trust our own memories?" Lily, who had been silently observing, finally spoke up, her voice laced with desperation. "Can't you see? This is exactly what it wants. It's feeding off our fear, our guilt. We're playing right into its hands." But her words fell on deaf ears. The atmosphere had shifted. The bond that had once held them together, now splintering under the weight of their shared paranoia. The once lively house, filled with the echoes of their laughter and joy, now seemed like a prison, its walls closing in, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Elena watched the scene unfold, a growing sense of dread settling in her chest. She had always been the peacemaker, the one who held the group together. Now even she felt the pull of isolation. The house's influence was undeniable. It seeped into their minds, warping their thoughts, turning them against each other. As the day gave way to night, the house seemed to come alive with a malevolent energy. Objects began to shift of their own accord. Chairs scraped across the floor, books toppled from shelves, and doors slammed shut with violent force. Friends flinched at every sound, their nerves frayed, their senses heightened to every creak and groan of the old building. The hallucinations came next. They started as fleeting shadows at the edge of their vision, whispers just out of earshot, but soon grew more vivid, more terrifying. Martin found himself staring into mirrors that reflected not his own face, but a twisted, distorted version of himself, eyes hollow and filled with malice. Tom was haunted by flickering images of the fire he had caused, the flames licking at his skin, the screams of those he had never been able to save echoing in his ears. Claire's visions were more insidious, creeping into her dreams and her waking moments alike. She saw the child again, the one they had all forgotten, the boy with eyes full of sorrow and a mouth that whispered secrets she couldn't bear to hear. She saw him standing at the foot of her bed, his presence as real as the rising sun, but when she reached out, he vanished, leaving only the cold weight of guilt in her heart. Lily fared no better. She saw herself, but not as she was now. The vision of her younger self stared back with a gaze filled with contempt, lips moving in silent judgment. It was as if the house was peeling back the layers of their memories, revealing the rot that lay beneath, the truth they had buried deep within their minds. Desperation took hold as the walls seemed to close in around them, the house warping their perception of reality. Elena, in a rare moment of clarity, gathered the courage to confront what they all feared most. "We need to face this," she urged, her voice trembling but resolute. "Whatever happened here, whatever we did, we have to confront it together. It's the only way we'll make it out of this." But the others, too lost in their own personal hells, could only shake their heads. Tom paced the room like a caged animal, his eyes wild with fear. "I can't," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "I can't face that again. It's too much." Martin stood by the window, his back to the group, staring out into the impenetrable darkness beyond. "What if it's too late?" he said quietly. "What if the house has already won?" Claire sank to the floor, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. "We were just kids," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "We didn't know, we didn't mean to." Elena felt her heart sink. The bonds that had once held them together were now shattered, the trust they had in each other eroded by the malevolent force that gripped the house. She knew they were on the brink, teetering on the edge of madness, and if they didn't act soon, they would be lost forever. But no matter how much she tried to rally them, to remind them of the strength they had once shared, the others were too consumed by their own fears, their own guilt. The house had isolated them, breaking them down one by one, until all that remained were fractured souls, each trapped in their own private torment. As the night deepened, the house's influence grew stronger, the walls pulsing with a malevolent energy, threatened to consume them all. Elena could feel it, a dark presence that lingered just out of sight, watching, waiting. She knew that if they didn't find a way to come together, to confront their shared past and the horrors they had buried, the house would devour them, leaving nothing but empty shells in its wake. But as she looked around at the faces of her friends, the people she had once trusted with her life, she realized that they were no longer the same. The house had changed them, twisted them into shadows of their former selves, and the bonds they had once shared had been irrevocably broken. And in that moment, as the house whispered its dark secrets into the corners of their minds, Elena understood that they were truly alone. Each of them isolated in their own fear and guilt, with no one left to trust but themselves. The night stretched on, an endless abyss of terror and uncertainty, and as the friends retreated further into their own minds, the house watched, patient and hungry, waiting for the moment when it would claim them all. Chapter 5: Confrontation. Elena stood at the top of the basement stairs, her hand trembling as it rested on the rusted doorknob. The others had gathered behind her, their faces pale, eyes wide with terror. The descent into the basement felt like a journey into the very heart of the house, into the darkness that had consumed them all. "We have to go down," Elena whispered, though her voice carried no conviction. The others hesitated, but the pull of the unknown, the need to finally uncover the truth, was stronger than their fear. They nodded in silent agreement, each step downward echoing like a tolling bell, marking the final moments of their shared descent into madness. The air grew colder as they descended, faint smell of mildew mixing with something far more ancient, a scent that carried the weight of years, forgotten sorrows and buried sins. The walls, slick with damp, seemed to close in around them, narrowing as they moved deeper into the belly of the house. The basement was a place of shadows, filled with the remnants of lives long past. Dust-covered toys lay scattered across the floor, their once bright colors now dulled and faded. Old letters, yellowed with age, lay crumpled in the corners, their ink smudged, the words illegible but heavy with unspoken pain. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint creak of the house settling above them, as if it too was watching, waiting. At the far end of the basement, a figure stood, small and shrouded in the gloom. Elena's breath caught in her throat as she realized what, or rather who, it was. The child. The boy they had all forgotten. He was there just as he had been all those years ago, only now his eyes were hollow, his face a mask of sorrow and accusation. "Why did you do it?" the ghostly figure asked, his voice a soft, chilling whisper, cut through the darkness like a knife. Question hung in the air, a weight pressing down on their chests, making it hard to breathe, harder still to speak. Memories came flooding back, sharp and painful, piercing through the veil of years that had obscured the truth. They remembered now, the boy who had been so eager to be their friend, a lonely child who had followed them everywhere, desperate to be included. And they remembered the game, cruel, thoughtless prank they had played that summer day. They had locked him in the basement, intending to scare him, to hear his frightened cries echo through the walls. Something had gone terribly wrong. "The house took him," Martin murmured, his voice trembling with realization. It fed on his fear and on ours. It's been feeding ever since." The boy nodded, his gaze never leaving theirs. "I tried to get out," he said, his voice tinged with a sadness that was almost too much to bear. "The house wouldn't let me. Kept me here. Kept me waiting for you." Elena stepped forward, her heart heavy with guilt. "We're sorry," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "We were just kids. We didn't know." The boy's expression softened. The sorrow remained. "It doesn't matter anymore," he replied, his voice barely audible. "The house wants something in return. It won't let you leave unless one of you stays behind to take my place." The words sent a shiver of dread through the group, the reality of their situation sinking in like a cold, hard truth. The house, with its endless hunger, demanded a sacrifice. It had claimed the boy, trapped him in a liminal state, feeding on the guilt and fear that had festered in the hearts of the children who had once called it their playground. Now it wanted more. "No," Claire said, her voice shaking as she backed away, her eyes wide with panic. We can't just leave someone here. We can't." "But we can't leave either," Tom said, his voice filled with a mix of despair and resignation. "The house won't let us." Elena looked at her friends, people she had known for so long, now mere shadows of who they once were. She knew the choice that lay before them, knew that it was a test, a final cruel demand from the house that had twisted their lives for so long. "We have to make this right," she said, her voice firm despite the fear that gripped her heart. "We have to accept what we did and face the consequences. It's the only way." Martin, his face pale, nodded slowly. "But who will stay?" The question hung in the air, heavy and oppressive, the silence that followed more suffocating than the darkest of nights. Each of them felt the weight of their guilt, crushing responsibility for the boy's fate and the terrible choice that now lay before them. "I will," Elena finally said, her voice steady. The others turned to her in shock, but she held up a hand to stop their protest. "It was my idea back then," she continued. "Prank. It was my idea. I should have known better. I should have stopped it." "No, Elena," Tom said, his voice choked with emotion. "We're all responsible. We should all stay." The boy shook his head. "Only one," he whispered. "Only one can stay." Elena stepped forward, her decision made, her fate sealed. She looked at the boy, at the ghostly figure that had haunted them for so long, and saw in his eyes not anger, but a deep, abiding sadness. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, but this time the words were for herself and for the child she had once been. The boy nodded, a single tear sliding down his pale cheek. "Thank you," said softly, and then he was gone, the darkness swallowing him whole. The house seemed to sigh, the oppressive atmosphere lifting just slightly, as if satisfied with the deal that had been struck. The others looked at Elena, their faces a mixture of grief and gratitude, knowing that she had saved them, but at a cost too great to bear. As they turned to leave, the basement door creaked open, the way out now clear. They walked up the stairs, their steps heavy, their hearts heavier still, knowing that the house had taken its due. Elena stayed behind, the darkness closing in around her. There was no fear in her heart now. She had made her choice, and with it found a strange sense of peace. The house had taken her, but in doing so, it had finally let the others go. And as the door to the basement slowly shut behind them, sealing Elena's fate, the house settled into silence. Its hunger temporarily sated, its secrets buried once more in the dark. Chapter 6: The Sacrifice and Escape. The house loomed above them, its darkened windows like empty eyes, watching, waiting. A decision hung in the air, suffocating in its weight. Each of them felt it, the dread of what was to come, the terror of the inevitable choice. The silence was thick, broken only by the distant creaks and groans of the ancient walls, as if the very structure was alive, urging them to decide. Martin, who had been the quietest among them since they had first entered the house, now stepped forward. His face was pale, his eyes shadowed with years of unspoken guilt. He had always known, deep down, that he was the one most responsible for what had happened all those years ago. It was his taunts that had goaded the others, his daring that had pushed the boundaries of what was once innocent play. "I'll stay," he said, his voice steady, filled with a somber acceptance. The others turned to him, their expressions a mix of shock and sorrow, but Martin held up a hand to silence them. "Should be moo. I've carried this guilt for too long. Maybe this is the only way to make it right." Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she knew, as did the others, that there was no arguing with Martin now. The house demanded a price, and he was willing to pay it. She reached out, gripping his hand tightly, as if by doing so she could somehow keep him tethered to the world they were about to leave behind. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. Martin gave a small, sad smile, and then, without another word, turned back towards the house. The others hesitated, their feet rooted to the spot, but Martin waved them on. "Go," he urged. "There's no time. The house, it won't wait forever." Reluctantly, they turned away, their steps faltering as they made their way toward the front door. The air was heavy, the sense of finality, something coming to an end, and yet beginning anew. As they stepped out into the night, the house shuddered, timbers groaning as if in protest. Behind them, Martin remained, a solitary figure in the darkened entryway, his expression one of resigned peace. He watched as his friends disappeared into the night, their forms swallowed by the shadows of the trees that lined the property. Then, with a deep breath, he stepped back inside, the door closing with a resounding thud behind him. As soon as the others reached the edge of the property, the ground beneath them began to shake. The house, that monstrous edifice of memories and regrets, seemed to heave, its walls cracking, its roof caving in. The very earth trembled as if rejecting the structure that had stood there for so many decades, feeding off the fears of those who dared to enter. They ran, their breath coming in ragged gasps, the sound of the crumbling house echoing in their ears. The path ahead of them seemed to stretch on forever, the night closing in around them. But they pushed forward, driven by the primal need to survive, to escape the clutches of the house that had nearly claimed them all. As they reached the bottom of the hill, they turned back, expecting to see the house standing tall in the distance. There was nothing. The place where the house had once been was now an empty, desolate patch of land, as if the structure had never existed at all. The realization that the house was truly gone, erased from existence, should have brought relief, but instead, it left a hollow ache in their hearts. They stood there, panting, staring at the empty space where so much of their past had been buried. The night was silent now, the oppressive atmosphere lifted, yet the sense of unease lingered, like a shadow that refused to fade. "We made it," Tom finally whispered, his voice shaky. There was no joy in the statement, only a deep, abiding sadness. Elena's phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her out of her daze. She fumbled to pull it out, her hands trembling. When she saw the name on the screen, her blood ran cold. It was Martin. She answered, her heart pounding in her chest. "Martin?" she breathed, hope and dread intertwining in her voice. There was a moment of silence on the other end, and then his voice came through, soft, almost a whisper. "Elena, it's still here. The house hasn't let me go." Lena's heart sank, a cold wave of fear washing over her. "What do you mean?" "The house, it's gone, Martin. We saw it collapse." Bitter laugh echoed through the phone, sending chills down her spine. "It's still here, Elena. Always been here. And now? So am I." The line went dead, and Elena stood frozen, the phone slipping from her grasp. The others looked at her, their faces reflecting the fear that had once again taken hold of them. The house may have crumbled, but its grip on them remained, its hunger never truly sated. As they turned to leave, the weight of what had transpired pressed heavily on their shoulders. They walked away from the hill, from the place where the house had stood. The shadow of it followed them, an unseen presence that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. And as they disappeared into the night, the air around them seemed to hum with a dark, twisted energy, as if the house, though unseen, was still watching, waiting for the moment when it would reclaim what it had lost. For it knew, as did Elena, that its hunger would never truly be satisfied.